Beardo Benjo.
Eastern Exorcist is a challenging game. I'm fairly well versed in games with a high difficulty curve. Some of my favourites are games such as Super Meat Boy and anything made by FromSoft. So believe me when I say this game is hard. To put it far less politely, Eastern Exorcist kicked my ass. Time and time and time again. But I kept coming back for more, because Eastern Exorcist never felt unfair. All the systems, all the combat mechanics within this game are there to be learned. If you go into this game with a lack of patience and just looking for a hack and slash side-scrolling adventure game, chances are you'll probably get your ass kicked too. But if you head into this adventure with a little bit of patience and willingness to learn your enemy's moves, then you're going to have a very, very good time with Eastern Exorcist. Now, if you're not fully up to speed on Eastern Exorcist, let me just give you a quick overview so you know kind of what you're getting into. In the game, you play as an exorcist who's on a task to take his fallen brother's ashes to their rightful resting places. But being an exorcist, along the way there are many demons and monsters that need slaying, and ultimately you're hunting down a maniacal king who needs some comeuppance. The game is an action-adventure, side-scrolling, combat-focused, light RPG elements romp, and it handles pretty much all of that fantastically. The emphasis here really is with the combat. It is incredibly tight, it is incredibly focused, but I'll come on to that when I start talking about the pros. The structure of my reviews is fairly simple. First I'll talk about the pros, then I'll talk about the cons, spend a little bit of time talking about the length of the game and the value proposition, and then I'll sum it all up in the end just to kind of give you a rounded opinion of what I thought of the game. Little bit of a spoiler alert though, I really liked this game. Eastern Exorcist hooked me in a way I did not expect to be hooked, and I found myself being drawn back for more punishment time and time again, so I am going to gush a little bit in the pros, and I did struggle to think of some cons. So yeah, I really, really liked this one. Alright, let's kick this off. Let's start with the positives, let's start with the pros. Number one, this game looks absolutely gorgeous. It is hand-drawn, frame by frame, using a Chinese ink painting style. And it looks every bit as wonderful as that sounds. It feels like you're playing a painting. It feels like you're playing a work of art. It's stunning. It's not overly complex. It is quite simplistic. But the character animations are smooth, their faces are expressive, the bosses are particularly horrendous and filled with detail, and the environments you fight in are absolutely wonderful to look at. One of the biggest reasons I kept coming back to the game was just how wonderful it looked. I could honestly stare at it all day. It's a fantastic achievement and it must have been painstaking to create, but honestly, from a smaller development team, this game looks beautiful and I love a game that has an art style that is unique. Number two on the positives, rewarding combat. The combat here is fantastic. It really is incredible. The game is centered primarily around the fighting, primarily around the combat. In between boss encounters, there are small sections of platforming where you fight basic drones and simple level enemies. But the real meat on the bones of Eastern Exorcist is those boss encounters, those tight one-on-one fights where you get to really dig into the combat. And there hasn't been a game, really, since the games that FromSoft put out, where I felt such an overwhelming sense of accomplishment when I've beaten one of those bosses. The combat system here gives you all the tools you need to succeed, but you do need to spend some time learning them. At first it might feel like the block and parry mechanics are there to be kind of used if necessary, but as the game ticks on and the bosses get harder, you really do realise that you need to be employing all of those skills to overcome some of these adversaries. Some of these bosses take no nonsense and they will absolutely mess you up if you do not look at the patterns they're employing and decide when the right time is to parry an attack, counter an attack, or block an attack, or simply just dodge the hell out of the way. The combat system is so fantastically well put together. I would play hours and hours and hours of a game set in this environment or any environment with these combat mechanics. It's just so well put together, and I absolutely loved it. The third positive, tight controls. Extremely tight controls. I played this entire game on an Xbox One Elite controller. I would recommend playing this game on a controller above all else. For me, it was the perfect way to play. When I say tight controls, I honestly never felt cheated in this game. Sure, I got angry. Some of these bosses bested me more times than I'd care to say, but it never felt like it was the game being cheap. It always felt like it was me refusing to learn something the game was trying to teach me. The controls are tight enough for you to be able to react and turn the tables in any circumstance, as long as you're willing to learn and look at your enemy's moves and timing to do so. If you throw yourself in blindly time and time again, yes, you're probably going to die, but it will be your fault. The game never cheats you over with sluggish controls or slow response times. They are extremely tight and they're extremely responsive. You just need to learn your enemy's moves if you want to succeed here, because the game gives you all the right tools, whether it's combat or the tightness of its controls, to succeed as long as you're paying attention. Number 4 on my positives list, forgiving checkpoints. I was so thankful for the checkpoint system in this game. Along the way you find small shrines. When you light the shrine, it gives you a place to level up your character, trade in some upgrade points to increase the amount of healing items you have, and also give you a checkpoint. These checkpoints are so frequent that even though you're throwing yourself against a boss 10, 20, 30, 40 times, you'll never feel like you've been cheated out and thrown miles back to traipse through a whole gauntlet of enemies to get back to where you are. 9 times out of 10, the checkpoint is right there next to the boss, so the speed and the time it takes to jump straight back into the action and get stuck back into the boss is so minimal that it makes jumping back in feel effortless, even though you're getting your ass handed to you time and time again. And number 5 on my pros list, great story. I really enjoyed the way that Eastern Exorcist told its story. The tale of this exorcist who's just trying to put the ashes of his fallen brothers back in their rightful places, but is being pulled left, right and centre to deal with all different villagers' queries and demons and issues is brilliant. It isn't particularly complex and it's easy to follow from start to finish, but it does enough to keep you engaged through the duration of the game. The characters in this game are humorous, expressive, and tell their stories with enthusiasm, even though there is no English audio option, which I'm genuinely happy about because the Chinese vocals lend genuine authenticity to the game. I could still tell the urgency just from reading the text on the screen and from listening to their voices. And although there are a few little gripes around translation, which I'll come onto in the cons, the story pulled me through from start to finish. It was simplistic and it engaged me the entire time. Now I normally only do 5 pros, 5 cons, but I'm going to squeeze in a cheeky 6th pro because I need to speak about it very quickly, and that's the sound design. The clashing of swords and the sound of attacking your enemies is wonderful. The music in this game does a great job of being a background setting, a backdrop to everything that's happening, but the sound design of the combat is wonderful. Every strike of your sword, every dodge is just beautiful. The enemies also let out fantastic sound cues that are key in knowing exactly when to dodge, when to parry, when to block. The sound design when it comes to combat here is phenomenal. Okay, let's dive into the cons. I did struggle to find some if I'm honest, but these are the ones I came up with. Number 1, difficulty spikes. Now I have said throughout this review so far that the game is challenging. It is an extremely challenging game, but there are particular spikes in difficulty that did seem to come out of nowhere. You might play for 2 hours and absolutely obliterate every boss in your path, and then you might come face to face with a particular ghost who batters you for about an hour and a half. A couple of the bosses felt particularly difficult and strangely placed throughout the journey. I can't fully tell if it was me refusing to learn their patterns and attack schedules and movements, or if it was just a genuine difficulty spike, but I do think there are a couple of bosses, one particular ghost at the end of the first chapter to be precise, where players might get stuck and might get a little frustrated that the difficulty has spiked so massively out of seemingly nowhere. Number 2 in my cons list, a lack of variety in the platforming sections. Now, as I said, the main focus of this game is combat, and the main focus of the combat is boss encounters. You're really just moving your way from one boss encounter to the next, but in between those boss encounters you do have small periods of platforming and fighting smaller minion style enemies. I would have loved to see a little bit more variety in these sections, maybe some more tricky platforming mechanics, maybe some traps and puzzles and hidden areas to explore. It is fairly formulaic. You move from left to right or right to left, beat the enemies in your way and just push yourself towards the next boss encounter. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that. The game really does leverage its boss encounters. You can tell there's a huge amount of love that's gone into them, but I would have liked to see those platform sections just fleshed out a little bit to kind of give me a little bit more variety between those encounters. Number 3 on my cons, the interface is a little bland. For a game that is so beautiful, and for a world that's so wonderfully realised and painstakingly hand-drawn, the interfaces felt a little generic and maybe even a little incomplete. Now, this point might be completely mute because I played a pre-release build, so come launch day those interfaces and those menu systems might be completely different. I may just be experiencing a placeholder, but they felt a little bland, the font felt a little generic and didn't really tie into the themes of the game and the way the game looked, and it just felt a little placeholdery. There were just a few kind of bizarre glitches in the menus. Some of the fonts didn't match up. Sometimes I had overlaid fonts, so one set of font that said something and then another font over the top saying something completely different. It really did feel like something that will probably be ironed out on launch day, so it isn't a huge con. As I say, I did struggle to figure some cons out, but the menus and the interface felt a little bit bland compared to the beautiful world that I was playing in. Number 4 on my cons list, the translation at times could be a little bit ropey. Now, this is something the developers have already commented on and it should be fixed come launch day, so again, this might be a mute point, but for me, a few times in the game when the characters were speaking, the text along the bottom would either be English that didn't quite flow or make any sense, or it would be not even English at all. The text along the bottom would be Chinese and it wouldn't particularly help me to understand what was happening. But as I've said, the developers have already commented on this in terms of pre-release builds and this should not be an issue come launch day, so probably not even a point. And finally, number 5 on my cons list, I would have loved to see different weapons that you could wield and different customizable skins for the character. Now, the skins side of things is purely cosmetic. I'm a sucker for cosmetics. I like to be able to make my character look a certain way and change the way they look within this world. The art style is so fantastic, I would have just loved to see more choices for the main character. The second point, being able to use different weapons, I just would have loved to try out some different long-reaching spears, maybe a bow, something like that within this game, because the combat system is so well put together. I would have just loved to try something that wasn't my traditional sword. The sword is wonderful, and honestly, playing the game, I got better and better and better at chaining combos, figuring out when to parry, figuring out when to block, etc, etc. But I would have loved to try something else in terms of a weapon. I would have loved to go head to head with a bigger, chunkier enemy and opted for something like a bow, so I could stay at a distance and ping them off from afar. But that just wasn't an option, and that's nobody's fault. This is the choice that the developers chose to give. This is the game that they wanted us to play, and the sword is the way they wanted us to play it. I personally just would have loved to see a little bit of variance because the combat system is so good that I would have loved to play with some different weapons. Okay, at this point in the review I traditionally talk about the length of the game and the value of the game. As it currently stands, there is no price point on Steam for Eastern Exorcist, so I can't particularly talk about the value proposition of the game in terms of how much it costs versus how much value and content that you actually get. What I can comment on though is the length of the game. I did manage to beat it in my review period and it took me 7 hours to beat. Now I think for a game like this, a side-scrolling hack and slash adventure focused on combat and boss encounters, 7 hours is a pretty good value proposition. Now I do think it could take some people longer than 7 hours, but then I think it could take people far less time than 7 hours. I think I'm sitting right in the middle. For the most part, I gelled with the combat mechanics pretty well and I figured out how to best these bosses on my 5th time, 3rd time maybe, but there were a couple that I really struggled with that pushed me into the high double-digit figures, which really stretched out my playtime. If you're patient, if you take the time to learn the combat mechanics, you should be able to beat this game in a respectable time. Now that's not to say the game is done. After completing the game, you unlock a new game plus mode, and you can attempt to take on bosses you've already beaten in exceptionally hard challenge modes. And I'm talking exceptionally hard. The bosses have extra health, they throw different attacks at you, their shield will just regenerate faster, and you can't stagger them. You'll hit them, and traditionally that would normally stagger them, and they just keep hitting you. So there's a huge amount of content to dig into here. I'm really happy with the amount of content on display. I would be happy with them charging pretty much whatever they want, just down to the combat mechanics and the painstakingly wonderful visuals that they've clearly taken a huge amount of time and care to get just right. That basically brings me to the end of my Eastern Exorcist review. I don't traditionally give scores for games, I just like to talk about them, talk about what was good, talk about what was not so good, and things that I would have improved myself. Eastern Exorcist was an absolute painstaking joy from start to finish. Yes, it was frustrating at times, but I never felt cheated by the game. I always threw myself back in again and again and again to overcome these bosses and these challenges, because the combat is so enjoyable, the world looks so fantastic, and the game is just so beautifully put together. For fans of games such as Castlevania, and although it's a little bit of a long stretch of a comparison, things like Dark Souls, if you're looking for a challenge and you're willing to learn the mechanics of the bosses you're going up against, give Eastern Exorcist a go. It genuinely is fantastic, and I think it will be worth your time and money. Although we haven't had a price yet, I'm pretty confident in whatever price they put on this game. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. If you did, please leave me a comment, please hit like, and if you enjoy the content, please hit subscribe. I put out content pretty much every week. If you're thinking of picking up Eastern Exorcist, or you have picked up Eastern Exorcist and you're struggling with a certain boss, I do also have a video on my channel with all the boss encounters completed, painstaking. There's no camera because you'd see me sweating and swearing and shouting, but the boss fights are all there if you get stuck, so go check that out as well. I'll see you soon for another one, guys. Take care of yourselves. See you later.